Immigration bill is mauled by the media as the Washington Post reports that he made disparaging comments about S-hole countries.
Let's not kid ourselves. Let's not pretend or dance around it. The sentiment the president expressed today is a racist sentiment.
The president seems to harbor racist feelings about people of color from other parts of the world.
The president of the United States is racist. A lot of us already knew that.
President Trump said something that almost every single person in America actually agrees with. An awful lot of immigrants come to this country from other places that aren't very nice.
These incredible statements coming from this president, there's no question that they're racist.
This is so abnormal. This is a freak show.
Is it a little offensive? Of course it is. But you know what? This doesn't move the needle at all. This is who Trump is. He doesn't care. He shoots from the hip.
Is it fair for commentators to denounce those crude comments as racist? Our news outlets handling the vulgarity, which the president partially disputes. And we'll look at an explosive Wall Street Journal story about the president, an ex-porn star, and an alleged six-figure payment that is generating strong denials from those involved. All it took was one Hollywood speech, but the media are swooning over Oprah for president.
Oprah's powerful speech is fueling speculation about a possible presidential run.
I got to ask you, Oprah 2020, it was all over Twitter last night after that speech.
She's an impressive woman. It was an impressive speech. And, you know, I half tongue-in-cheek encouraged her to run for the Democratic nomination.
I absolutely don't think that her position has changed. I don't. You know, I was up talking to her very late last night. I do think this, though, guys. I do think she's intrigued by the idea.
So why are the pundits giving so much attention to such a far-fetched scenario? Steve Bannon leaving Breitbart after his dramatic falling out with Trump, why he lost his media platform, and where does that leave the conservative side? Plus, I'll be making a personal announcement about my latest project. I'm Howard Kurtz, and this is Media Buzz. The report that President Trump privately told members of Congress he wanted to limit immigration from such places as Haiti, El Salvador, and some African nations, quote, why are we having people from all these S-hole countries come here, caused an international media uproar, including some criticism on Fox News.
Well, number one, President made a mistake in making those comments, no question.
I've known him for 30 years. I know him well, and I like him and admire him, but this is a new low.
The White House didn't deny the Washington Post story, but the president tweeted the next day that while he'd used tough language during the meeting about the Dreamers, this was not the language used. But Democratic Senator Dick Durbin told reporters the president actually had referred to S-hole countries. Joining us now to analyze the coverage, Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist and a Fox News contributor. Susan Frischio, chief congressional correspondent of The Washington Examiner. And Marie Harf, former Obama administration spokeswoman and also a Fox News contributor. Molly, the S has really hit the fan over these comments reported by the Washington Post. What do you make of the explosive and relentless way it's been covered?
Right. I mean, when you use this type of language and the president chooses to be this vulgar with alarming regularity, of course it's going to be news. At the same time, I'm not sure that the media have covered themselves in glory with how they have covered this. They've really failed to explain the context of his remarks. They didn't really have any curiosity about why Dick Durbin was leaking this, you know, his goal of sabotaging a supposed deal that they're working on. And mostly it seemed like they were using this in the way that they've used so many discussions about immigration, which is to silence people who want to change from our current sort of random immigration policy to a merit-based system where people are judged for their chance of success in this country. And that is very frustrating for people who are interested in this debate.
Marie, this was a slur, no question about it. Even some Republicans have criticized it. But then you look at some of the rhetoric, for example, Jason Johnson of The Roots said on MSNBC, the comments show Trump is a white supremacist, a terrorist sympathizer, and a danger to non-whites. So is some of the reaction over the top?
I'm sure you can find over the top reaction to many things that President Trump does. But that doesn't mean that some of the outrage, in fact, most of the outrage is well placed. You know, this fits into a pattern of comments he's made, whether it's after Charlottesville, whether it's going all the way back to when he took out the full page ad about the Central Park Five. He has a long history of wading into discussions about race and using racially charged language. And that plays a part. Exactly. And I think that plays a part and definitely influences how it's being covered today stand the charges of racism. And I think that that is a conversation the country needs to be having based on everything he's done over decades.
Susan, many presidents, many politicians, many of us use bad language in private. The Obama White House slogan was, "Don't do stupid S" in foreign policy. Would the coverage have been different if he'd expressed the same sentiment but without that word or some version of that word, instead, lousy third world countries?
Absolutely, because in this sense, everyone started to put the S word up without the asterisks, not Fox, but other places. And I think they were trying to convey a message here that they think the president is he's such a degenerate and a racist that they actually have to put these words on the screen that these FCC regulated broadcast stations violating all kinds of rules to put these up there to make the point that this president is just so bad. He used the S word.
Since you mentioned the coverage of the word, I mean, the New York Times, the Washington Post, which broke it, actually used the word. MSNBC, CNN used it 36 times in one night, according to one report. Fox hasn't been using it. I actually disagree with that decision. I think it should be used sparingly and not for shock value, but I think it's one of those words that is important to understanding, well, just what did he say, even though obviously some people find it offensive. Now, in the past, you've had liberal commentators, I've played the sound, not just questioning Donald Trump's mental health, but saying he's a racist. But now you have anchors, Anderson Cooper, correspondents like Jim Acosta and others, Andrea Mitchell, almost stating it as fact. Is there a sense of, aha, we can finally use the report of this word to prove the media narrative that this president has racist tendencies?
I don't know what they were thinking, because there were actually so many leaps of logic. There's no question that he used this term or something like it, something very similar. There was some dispute about the precise nature of the term to refer to these countries. And then they said, ergo, he's racist. But they didn't explain how that works out, and they just asserted it as fact. Or they said that his use of the term chain immigration is racist. Well, no, that's actually just the policy term that you use for people who come after a family member comes. That's just the term. And so I think people know that, and then they just dispute. You need to make the case, and they didn't make the case. And there's no need to go out there and assert as fact when there's plenty to talk about that is factual.
Agree the media didn't make the case?
I actually think a lot of media organizations did, and you saw them going through this long history. You saw them going back to when he was sued for racial discrimination in housing in New York. You saw them talk about when he went after the American judge, calling him Mexican, calling Mexicans racist. I actually think good news organizations, some of them, did go through that history, and I do think it's hard to know what's in people's hearts, so I'm always cautious by saying he has feelings of this. You can't know that, but he has undoubtedly made statements that white supremacists have embraced. They think he's on their side, and he's done nothing to dissuade them from thinking that.
What we actually are talking about in this country is whether we should continue our immigration policy or change it. And there's an incoherence to how we talk about this. When President Trump said that he wanted to end temporary status, everyone said, you can't send people back to these hellholes. It's a barbaric region, and it's horrible. And nobody said, that's racist. Right. But then when he refers to these same places as this, then they go, well, that's clearly racist.
Well,
that doesn't make sense.
Talking now about the underlying substance, and obviously it's the word that has gotten, spawned 1,000 or 1,000,000 cable news segments. There were a number of commentators on the right who were unhappy. The president appeared willing in that televised session to negotiate some kind of compromise with the Democrats on legalizing the Dreamers program, essentially, in exchange for funding the border wall, chain migration, and some other points. Let's take a brief look at what some of them had to say.
It was a completely different Donald Trump from the one we watched on the campaign trail just 2 years ago. So what was the point of running for president?
This is a disaster. It was the lowest day of his presidency. It seems as if Trump thinks he's going to get all this great press by giving the left everything they want.
Well, Susan, the president got a lot of positive coverage from mainstream media for having that session, but then we saw people who usually support the president being very critical.
They are worried that he is going to go back on his campaign promise about being tough on border security. And because the president speaks two ways. On the one hand, he wants to make a deal and he wants to work with Democrats. That's the businessman in Donald Trump. But on the other hand, he also wants the tough border security that he promised. He made this major campaign promise, the big, beautiful wall. For him, he's kind of stuck. So he goes in and tries to negotiate with Democrats, and he's got to make a decision. Is he going to have a deal, or is he going to have, the very things he promised on the campaign trail?
Right,
that's going to be a hard deal for him.
That's what was so striking, is that some of the conservative commentators acted like this was a betrayal, when in fact he was trying to negotiate for things that he also wants, chief among them funding for this wall along the border with Mexico.
I think they felt like it was a betrayal because it was so different than his campaign rhetoric. But these are actually much more interesting angles for the media to explore. How his base is extremely worried that he will sell them out, or how Dick Durbin was trying to sabotage a supposed deal they're working on. That's actually much more interesting than all this drama over
And now he actually tries to work out deals, and he doesn't just try to toe the party line.
Well, and that's, I think, what some conservative Republicans were worried about during the Republican primary. He is a lifelong Democrat who they were concerned would actually cut deals with Chuck and Nancy. And so a lot of us saw that meeting in the Oval Office as him being open to actually getting a deal, which is, at the end of the day, what governing is actually about. It's much harder to govern than to be a commentator on TV.
People on both sides hate compromise, but I think many average Americans would like to see some form of cooperation so that something gets done here in Washington. All right, President, one of the press availabilities this week, also had something to say about the state of the nation's libel laws. Roll tape.
Our current libel laws are a sham and a disgrace and do not represent American values or American fairness. You can't say things that are false, knowingly false, and be able to smile as money pours into your bank account.
What was the president really upset about there?
I don't know. I mean, criticism of the press is perfectly fine. And while technically he didn't say anything specific enough to be totally alarmed by, threatening legal action because you don't like the coverage you're getting, it violates the spirit of the First Amendment and the spirit of press freedom that we have, not to mention that nobody on earth has benefited more from the United States' lax laws on slander and libel against public figures than Donald Trump, who has said that Ted Cruz's father assassinated JFK or that Barack Obama wasn't an American. So he should know that these laws have benefited him.
But by the way, you can sue right now for people publish things that are knowingly false. Supreme Court rulings say that you can't publish things with reckless disregard for the truth or with malice. It may be hard to win the suit, particularly against public figures, but he hasn't made a specific proposal about changing the libel laws. He's talked about this before.
That's right. And Molly's absolutely right that Donald Trump has told, by some estimates, a record number of falsehoods going all the way back to the Barack Obama birther stuff, which I think a lot of people saw as the way he got into politics. I think this says a lot about Donald Trump's thin skin. When he doesn't like stories, he threatens legal action. He says they're fake news even when they're not. And there's no legal basis for what he's saying. I think he's just trolling the media here.
Well, he's good at trolling the media. But as a businessman, look, he did file a couple of suits. He sued a author from the New York Times for saying he wasn't worth as much money as he claimed. He sued a Chicago Tribune critic for criticizing as ugly the proposed design for Trump Tower. But as president, if you actually file a suit, I mean, you keep the story alive. You do depositions.
This is just the way he engages with the press. This is all bark. He's not going to try to change libel laws. It would be impossible. He engages the press. He's in an adversarial relationship with the media. He's always been in one. Yet he also needs the media, which I think explains the otherwise baffling move of letting Wolf, the author, into the White House.
An adversarial relationship, but also a symbiotic relationship, it seems to me. All right, let me get a break here. I had the Oprah boomlet, or the media openly promoting the television icon for 2020. But when we come back, the president and the former porn star, a newspaper story about an alleged payment before the election generates a spate of strong denials. The Wall Street Journal is reporting that Donald Trump's lawyer, weeks before the election, arranged a $130,000 payment to former porn star Stormy Daniels under an agreement that she not go public with an alleged sexual encounter said to have taken place back in 2006. And the New York Times is adding new details to that account. But there have been a spate of denials, the White House says. These are old, recycled reports which were published and strongly denied prior to the election. Trump lawyer Michael Cohen, while not addressing the alleged payment explicitly, said the Journal's story was outlandish, adding President Trump once again vehemently denies any such occurrence, as has Ms. Daniels. As for Stormy Daniels, she says it's not true that she had a sexual relationship with Donald Trump, and that, quote, rumors that I have received hush money from Donald Trump are completely false. So Molly Hemingway, first of all, your quick take on the Wall Street Journal piece.
Well, the Wall Street Journal asserted something as true, but provided zero evidence to support that fact. So I think readers should...
Zero evidence. I mean, quoting sources as saying the money went to her through a
There is
lawyer.
not a single named source, and everyone who's on the record denies it. And so I think readers have a right to know why they ran with it. Why are they so certain, given that both parties deny it and everybody who's quoted on the record denies it? That's something readers should know.
Okay, but then we have the Times yesterday interviewing Jake Weisberg. He's the head of Slate Magazine Group, saying that he had got pre-election text messages from Stormy Daniels, her real name is Stephanie Clifford, that, according to these text messages, she had an affair with Donald Trump in 2006. Michael Cohen, the lawyer, was late in paying her the $130K, and now she flatly denies it.
Yes. And
What are readers to think?
Yeah, the Slate editor actually took to Twitter to clarify some stuff from that New York Times
This is
story.
Julia Turner.
Yeah, and she said that the reason why they didn't run with the story is because they couldn't verify it, and that she demanded money, and when they refused to pay her, she stopped cooperating. So that's not the best sourcing either for the original claim. Not that Donald Trump is a paragon of moral virtue or anything.
The text messages seem like evidence to me, although the Slate editor, Julia Turner, also said that she was demanding money from Slate, which doesn't pay for stories, and that's why it broke down. But otherwise, you've got this sort of odd spectacle. You have two top newspapers in the country reporting this sensational allegation and varying levels of denial from everybody involved.
Any other president, and this might be a really major story, but this is President Trump. He came with this baked in. Everybody knew what he was about. He wasn't Harry Truman. He was a thrice married Queens businessman who had long been in the tabloids. So I think the news value here really isn't that important. And I also think would point out.
Is it the story at all?
Well, first of all, the story is not new. It came out November 6th, 2016. So this is not a new story. The beginnings of this were a couple years old here. But sure, you want to report if someone's gotten a payoff from the president over an alleged affair. Absolutely.
Well, given that the Journal did report this just before the election, that Stormy Daniels was in talks to tell her story on Good Morning America, and that all this obviously fell through. She did not go public. And given the allegations that surrounded Donald Trump after the Access Hollywood tape, how much will people care about this?
Well, I think Susan's right. This was kind of baked in with Donald Trump. If 53% of white women voted for him after they heard the Access Hollywood tape, I'm not sure this moves the needle in terms of public perception of him. That being said, I still think it's a story that the public deserves to see, deserves to hear about. And Susan's also right that any other president, can you imagine if this was Barack Obama, for example, what the news coverage would be like? So yes, she denied it. Stormy Daniels denied it, but it's also been reported that as part of her settlement, she has to deny it. So we'll see what happens from here. I don't think it'll move the needle, but it's still important.
But from a media angle, you know, these things are going to outlast Donald Trump, and the normalization of entirely anonymous sourcing or no verifiable fact that a reader can check, that's not good for the industry, and that's something that journalists should care about, because Donald Trump won't always be here to excuse their worst
Let me challenge you on that. The fact that there are anonymous sources doesn't mean the story isn't true. Now, the level of distrust of the media is so great that people naturally are wondering about that. The Wall Street Journal, and by the way, people saying, oh, it's a paper owned by Rupert Murdoch, and even this paper is reporting it's done a good job covering President Trump.
But readers have a right to know why they were so certain.
What if you can't reveal the sources?
The problem with anonymous sourcing, and that's all it's been with the Trump-Russia collusion, everything. It's always been anonymous. When you have an anonymous source, you don't know their agenda. And so you don't understand why they're talking to the
readers
reporters.
And viewers don't know the
That's absolutely right. The journalist says, and you're supposed to trust the journalist's filter. And that's what we're seeing with all of this reporting.
And by the way, Marie, after what Bill Clinton did in office, a consensual affair, if it happened in 2006, does not sound like a media bombshell. If it happened.
Well, I think it's not a media bombshell, but going to anonymous sources for a second, there are a lot of people who believe every anonymous source who criticizes the administration I worked in because it fits into their worldview. So yes, we need to be careful as readers about anonymous sources. We have to have reporters who do their jobs well and evaluate those anonymous sources, but there also has to be a place for them in our media landscape today. And I don't think we should discount everything just because there's not a name attached to it.
There have been a lot of good and important stories that have been based on unnamed sources, but clearly there's a lot of public distrust, as I said. Marie Harf, Susan Faricio, Molly Hemingway, thanks very much for stopping by this Sunday. Ahead, actor Michael Douglas is denying sexual harassment allegations even before they are published. But up next, a personal announcement about my latest project.
Visit buywaxrx.com. Use promo code WAX for free shipping today.
I have a little news to share that's been a long time in coming. I've been covering Donald Trump since the day he came down that golden escalator 2.5 years ago, but really much longer than that, since I first interviewed the Donald when I was based in New York back in the late 80s. As we've talked about on this program, the reporting, analysis, commentary, and pontification on candidate Trump and now President Trump has been overwhelmingly negative. Some of it fair and legitimate, to be sure, but some of it wrong or slanted or sensationalized and at times outright hostile. And this president's attacks on the press have been just as harsh and unrelenting. Sometimes